Okay, so to start with, you're going to need a piece of paper. I just use some hot pressed smooth watercolour paper. Then I like to masking tape it down. I do this to prevent the paper from buckling too much, and I like to keep the paper still when I'm working. So the masking tape I'm using is roughly 1/2 inch thick, and I just masking tape an entire border around the picture. I like using the masking tape in leaving a border because it gives a nice clean edge that just, I feel, adds a little bit more to the picture itself. So here I am just masking taping it up, and then I also masking tape the sides of the paper to make sure it's all taped down, to make sure none of that paper buckles. Then this is the picture I'm working off, and I actually trace the picture onto the paper just to speed things up, because this was only a little sketch, not an actual finished painting. And then I use pastel fixative to seal the picture and make sure none of that pencil will move. Next, I use a palette. So I'm just using a cheap palette for this, disposable palettes that I reuse. You can see here that I've clearly scraped off the paint, and I'm using them again. Each sheet lasts me probably 4 or 5 paintings before I throw it away. So we'll start with titanium white, then peach, then pink, then a light magenta, then a Naples yellow, a light mauve colour, Phthalo blue, Paynes Grey, an orange, and rose. I'm going to use those colours for the background of this piece. So I'm going to use a 1 inch flat brush, a 1/2 inch flat brush, and a frayed round brush. And then don't forget, you also need a jug of water, something to hold your water, and some paper towels to dry off your brushes. So I'm starting with the 1 inch flat brush, and I'm just mixing some of the Naples yellow with the orange to get a sort of warm orangey colour. I'm thinning it down because I want to create a wash first, and I'm just filling in and laying in some of that colour on the background. I add a little bit more of the Naples yellow over the top to lighten some areas up. And you can see I'm constantly washing and cleaning my brush and wiping it on the paper towel. Next, I want some of the rose, and I mix that rose with the orange to give me a reddier colour. This is eventually going to be my sky. It's going to be lit up by warm clouds, so I want that red, that orange look showing through. Next, I add a bit of white, and this is to start the clouds. So this is just to block them in, give them a rough idea of where I want them to go. Next, I use some of that purple, that mauve colour, to add the sky and add the clouds. The clouds are actually going to be the blue parts, and they're going to be the colder parts because I want those to be in shadow, and then the sun showing through from behind. So the sky is actually red in this picture, but the clouds are blue because they're going to be the bits that are in shadow, that are going to be a bit lighter in colour. I add some of the Phthalo blue and some Paynes Grey, just to darken them. You can see me mix it in the corner. I'm using the small 1 inch brush and the frayed round brush for this step. Okay, all I'm doing is using thin washes of colour and building up those shadows, and then using a little bit of water on the frayed round brush just to blend it in and smooth it out. Very similar to as you would do with a watercolour technique. I'll point out that I am using acrylics here. They are the Arteza acrylics, but any brand of acrylics will work. I find that the Arteza paints dry very, very quickly, so they don't give you much time to work, and they give the picture an almost plasticky feel, which is good for some pictures and not so good for others. So I'm just adding the darker layers just by adding little bits of Paynes Grey and blue to it, and then adding the highlights by adding little bits of titanium white to my blue-grey mix. Okay, all I'm doing is adding highlights where I think those highlights would be, but I've got my reference photo, so I am studying that closely and making sure I'm putting them where I think they should be. That doesn't mean I'm sticking to that reference photo exactly. You don't have to stick to your reference photos exactly. In fact, it's better to have a little bit of creativity. Next, I'm going to work on the trees below. So that was olive green, raw umber, and sap green are the colours that I'm going to be using. Right, and all I'm doing is mixing those colours together and creating some trees or some leaves. I'm not painting in every single individual leaf as I should. I'm just using the end of the small flat brush just to give the impression of leaves. Now I'm adding a bit of the olive green for highlights. Then adding a little bit of white and a touch of the mauve for some more highlights. And then next we're going to add some yellow orange. And then some raw sienna. Okay, that's what that is. I'm mixing them in with my mauve colour and creating almost orangey brown or a pale orangey brown, and we're going to start on the tree. Okay, again, I'm just using that flat brush. I've not got hundreds of brushes for this painting, just a couple. Some of them you've seen, some of them I will show you later on. So for the shadows of the tree, I've mixed a bit of blue and a bit of Paynes Grey into my brownie mix. I'm just blocking in the areas of where I want that shadow to go. I realised for this painting I actually started painting on the wrong side of the paper. Usually my blockings would be a bit more watered down than this, but because I started painting on the wrong side of the paper, I needed to use thicker paint to put down a base layer that would protect the paper underneath. Next, I'm using another yellowy orange colour. I think it's called Oxide Yellow. I'm adding in a yellow ochre. Mars Black, and then a bit more titanium white. Okay, and I'm using those colours and the rest of the colours on the palette for the details of that tree. I think this is me getting up and getting some more brushes. I think this is where I'm going to be using a different brush. Still using the flat brush, the round brush to start, but I also might bring in a smaller detail brush later on. It's always good to have your brushes handy and in your workspace so you can spend more time painting, less time faffing around looking for brushes. Hey, there's actually a little bit of burnt umber on my palette as well. I forgot to show you that, but I'm mixing the burnt umber with the black, and I'm starting by using that mix to add in the lines of the bark. I always start dark to light, and now I've put that base layer down, I'm quite happy using watered down paint on that paper because that first layer acts as a protective cover. So all I'm doing, using that Mars Black and burnt umber mix, just drawing in, blocking in the tree. Again, I'm not really following the reference photo exactly. I'm just sort of making it up as I go along, but I do have that reference photo there to guide me if I am struggling. Okay, now using the round brush, I'm mixing a little bit of Naples yellow, a little bit of Phthalo blue, and some of the peach. And this is just the areas of the highlights. I'm being quite rough with this. I want the brush to drag along the surface of the paper because that'll give me like interesting marks and variation that would be in the tree that I wouldn't want to paint with a tiny little brush. So I'm just dragging that brush around, showing where the highlights on that tree will be. I always think the more variation that you can get in a painting, the better. The little bits, the little inconsistencies, they are the things that make a painting unique, make it interesting, and make it different from a photograph. So I try to add as many of those in as I can. I want that texture. I want that feel of a painting when I'm painting. I don't want it to look like a photograph. Okay, always remember, dry your brush off after each colour, and never leave your brushes brush down in the water because they'll just fray. So here I am using the detail brush. I'm just using the black mixed with a bit of burnt umber. This one's a bit more blacky than before. And I'm just using that detail brush to show where the shadows of that tree would be, around the bits of the bark that are showing through. It's important that you don't just use one brush and mix up your brushes when you're painting. Again, it's going back to that variation. The more variation you can get, the better it's going to look, the better it's going to be. See, all I'm doing is following the lines of the tree trunk, following that reference photo slightly, but making it up as well. Just doing vertical lines, making them jagged, moving them about a bit. And it's starting to look a little bit more like a tree. Once that dried, I wasn't quite happy with the colours, so I wanted to glaze over some more orange and some purples over the top of the colours that I've just put down. To do that, I'm just using very, very watered down paint. If you're doing this, if you are going to glaze, make sure you start with clean water. Because if you don't start with clean water, you're going to start glazing the colour of the muddy water that you have. So whenever you're doing some glazing, make sure to change your water and start with fresh water. Right, next, I think I'm using a small angled brush. Okay, and I'm just making a slightly browner colour to paint in the areas of the bark. When I paint trees, I'm not very good at painting trees. They're not my favourite thing to paint. And I always seem to get them a little bit wrong, but that doesn't matter. As long as you can tell it's a tree, that's what you're going for. It doesn't have to be the most photorealistic tree in the world. But my technique to painting trees is the same as my technique for painting fur. I work in layers. I build up the structure and I build up my details on top of that structure. So that's what you can see me doing here. Here I'm actually building up the bark on top of the inside of the tree. Because what I wanted to give this tree a look or a feel of was some of that bark was fading away. I continued to build that up. I missed a little bit of filming here, but I continued to build that up with darks and lights until I was happy with it. And then over the top of that, using that small detail brush, I just used the darker paints to go over those details once more, add in those lines of the tree. Which is what I'm doing here, to just reinforce that shape, reinforce the tiny little structures found within that tree that I'd covered over from before. If you are struggling with this, just follow your reference photo. Break your picture up into small areas and use your reference photo. Okay, I let it dry and then I wanted to glaze over some more shadows, so I'm just using a bit of Paynes Grey there, just to glaze in some shadows. And now I'm adding in some various yellows. The yellows are for the leopard itself. So I'm using I think it's just a bright yellow here, mixed with a tiny little bit of yellow ochre, just to block in the base colour of that yellow, of that leopard. Again, I'm putting it in thicker than I usually would because of the paper, because of it buckling, because it coming up, because I did the wrong side of the paper. So when you're painting, make sure you paint on the right side of the paper. Okay, I'm just adding some brown to my yellow for the shadowy areas. This is the way that I always work. I always block in a base colour and then build up the shadows. I just roughly block it in. This allows me to visualise the shape and the structure of what I'm painting first, rather than just starting from a white piece of paper and building up a tiny little area at a time. I like to block it in first and visualise what I'm going to paint. Just adding a mid colour now between that bright yellow and the dark, a bit more orangey. And then adding my highlight colour, because I figured that the yellow was a bit too saturated, so I wanted a bit whiter, a bit greyer, a bit more toned down. Didn't want it to be quite as bright. So just very simply blocking in the basic structures of that leopard. And just following my reference photo, using very thin washes of paint. I am using the small angled brush just to give the appearance of fur. Because it's quite frayed, it can do that. Then, once I'm happy with it, I'll use a small detail brush and some titanium white and a tiny little bit of, I think it was the bright yellow, to add in some smaller strands of fur where the highlights are going to be. Okay. Again, because it's a small picture, you don't have to go into too much detail. Okay. It's not about getting every single strand of fur in the correct place, it's just giving the appearance of fur. If this was a larger painting, you'd have to take more care, but because it's so small, it doesn't really matter. So I've added a little bit more yellow to my paint. And I'm just building up those layers of fur. I promise it will start to look like a leopard soon. A little bit of zooming in, sorry for the poor quality camera. I'm adding a little bit of a pinker colour to it now. So I add a little bit of the rose colour to my mix, just for those areas that I feel might be in a little bit of cast shadow. Now, but as you can see, I'm not being massively careful, I'm being quite rough with it. It's only a little sketch. I will probably use this for a larger proper painting, but for now, being rough, being quite inaccurate is okay. So now I'm mixing a little bit of Paynes Grey, some burnt umber and some Phthalo blue to make a black colour. And I'm using that to add in the spots. Now, the spots are really important when you're doing leopards and when you're doing animals with spots. I do recommend using the reference photo as best as you can, because the shape and the direction of the spots will change as it moves around the shape and the form of the animal. So study those closely. Now, you don't want to just put hundreds of uniform little dots that are all exactly the same size, exactly the same shape, because it won't look realistic. It'll look very flat. What you want to do is use the spots to influence and follow the form of that animal. Now, the more that you can do this, the more 3D and the more realistic your painting will be. Okay, so that's all I'm doing here. I'm just using that small detail brush to add in those spots, making sure that I am always studying my reference photo and putting those spots in the correct place. Again, this is important, more so on bigger paintings, as I'm just using this as a colour study, as a quick little sketch. I'm not overly fussed about what I'm doing. This piece in total probably took me between 2 to 3 hours to complete. Whereas the actual painting that I'm going to do will probably take me a few weeks, if not a month, to finish. All I'm doing, building up those spots, putting them where I think they should go, studying that reference photo. Really, really straightforward. But notice how they are not all the same. Notice how I'm mixing up, adding variation to the shape of my spots. That's one of the most important things to making good painting. Other than the composition and the colours that you use, it's making sure there's lots of variation and interest for the viewer to look at. So it's looking slightly more like a leopard now. Still not exactly where I'd want it to be. So to finish it off, or to do what I do next, is mix a little bit of blue, Paynes Grey, and using the small angled brush, I just glaze over some shadows. Right, these are the cooler areas of the face, the areas that aren't going to be hit by the light, and this just reinforces the form of that leopard. Okay, I do the same for the face, but this time with a little bit of burnt umber, some Naples yellow, and then we're getting close to being finished. So the next thing I do, a little bit of white, a little bit of yellow, just to bring back some of those highlights. Okay, I'm not using pure white, even though it might look like it. It's pure white with a touch of the yellows. Just bringing in some of those fur strands using a small detail brush. I add a touch more yellow, so I want to bring back some of those fur details in the areas that are hit by light. Again, I'm just carrying on doing this, refining this picture, studying my reference photo, looking at what's different, looking what I want to change, being very careful with it. Okay, all I did, mixed a little bit of the mauve, a little bit of Paynes Grey, a little bit of Mars Black, using the smaller brush, and watering it down just to glaze in some more shadows. I made a little mistake. It's easy to rub away, just a little bit of a paper towel and some water before it dries. Now I'm just adding some of those highlights that'll appear, just separating it from the tree trunk, and then adding the whiskers using the small detail brush. And to finish it off, all I'm doing, signing it with a little bit of the mauve. I use a hairdryer to peel away the masking tape. If you melt the glue a little bit with the hairdryer, it leaves a much neater, much cleaner edge. And I really recommend doing that if you are going to use masking tape on paper, so it doesn't peel away the paper underneath and ruin your picture. There you see, a nice clean edge, and you can also see sort of the plasticky shine that's on there. So here's the finished piece. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you liked it, please make sure to give us an actual like and subscribe to our channel. It really means a lot. As always, thank you so much for watching, and for more wildlife art tips, head to studiowildlife.com.